I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness.
Starving, hysterical, naked,
dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn,
looking for an angry fix.
Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection
To the starry dynamo in the machinery of night.
Who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high
Sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz.
They call you Beat Generation.
On October 7th, 1955, the sixth poet at Sixth Gallery reading, where Allen Ginsberg first read Howl, took place. When I became Literary Society president, I read about the Sixth Gallery reading, and it became my goal to organize a reenactment of it. I found people to perform the poems, I created a Facebook event, and at the reenactment, I spoke on why this reading was so important. It's considered to be the beginning of the San Francisco literary renaissance, as well as the birth of the Beat Generation. The Beat Generation was a group of poets, artists, writers, and thinkers who questioned American society and inspired a whole generation, as well as the next generation, the movements of the 60s and 70s, and even the hipsters that we consider mainstream today. I found the reading fascinating and decided to do more research. I was surprised to discover that it had been reenacted before, all over the world, from Los Angeles and New York to Manchester, England, and Venice, Italy. I became obsessed. I needed to know why this poetry reading had become an historical reenactment event. A poetic ritual. I needed to know why Howl, why San Francisco, but most importantly, why poetry? Why a poetry reading? I embarked on 2 road trips, one with my friend Margaret and one by myself. I went to study at the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics at Naropa University. I visited the archives at Stanford and Columbia to figure out why. However, instead of narrating what I learned for you, I'm going to let the people I learned from do the talking. We'll be hearing from Anne Waldman, Jack Foley, Jonah Raskin, Clark Coolidge, Thurston Moore, John Burnside, and Jerry DeGroot. I met some of the best minds of that generation along the way.
Who drove cross-country 72 hours to find out if I had a vision, or you had a vision, or he had a vision, to find out eternity.
I wanted to know if you'd heard of the Sixth Gallery from when you were
Of course.
in New York.
When it was happening.
Yeah, did you hear about
no,
the
I was
Howl
only
reading?
Howl, I was
Or,
11 years old. 11 years old, but when Howl came out, I mean, my father had a copy of Howl.
Anyway, I followed the whole gang of howling poets to the reading at Gallery 6 that night, which was, among other important things, the night of the birth of the San Francisco Poetry Renaissance. Everyone was there. It was a mad night.
Well, it was in October 1955, either the 7th or the 13th. I think it was personally the 7th. Michael McClure had been asked to arrange a reading, and he was too busy to do it, so he asked his friend Allen Ginsberg, and they'd just begun to know each other, to arrange the reading. And Ginsberg said he would, and he invited McClure, and Philip Lymantia himself, of course, was going to read.
I think that Ginsberg was largely responsible for organizing the reading and making it happen.
Allen Ginsberg, yeah, he was open to everything. I mean, he was extraordinarily gentle soul.
In California, they were far from the publishing centers of New York City and other places, Boston. They didn't get published easily. They read their poems. That was their version of publishing. That is to say, you make the poems public by reading them.
Readings weren't a big thing, you know. That was kind of an early reading, you know, that Allen kind of got imposed upon to organize. And, you know, he of course took it by the head and ran with it, as Allen always did. You know, made a whole thing out of it. Crammed little space, you know, you can imagine the building is still there, but it's a laundry or something.
It was emceed by Kenneth Rexroth, who was an important person, a kind of father figure to the Beats at the time, though he later became more problematically related to them.
Kenneth Rexroth was at the Sixth Gallery reading, and he had a salon in San Francisco. He was a San Francisco bohemian anarchist, and when Ginsberg and Kerouac came to San Francisco, they gravitated to his place, and they went there and they heard discussions, and they learned a lot about haiku and Asian poetry from Rexroth, and to be in his place felt like being part of a sort of vital literary scene.
Jack Kerouac was visiting Ginsberg at the time, so Kerouac was there, though he didn't read.
And I was the one who got things jumping by going around collecting dimes and quarters from the rather stiff audience standing around in the gallery and coming back with 3 huge gallon jugs of California Burgundy and getting them all piffed so that by 11 o'clock, when Alva Goldbrook was reading his whaling poem Whale, and drunk with arms outspread, everyone was yelling, "Go, go, go!" And Reinhold Cacoethes, the father of the Frisco poetry scene, was wiping tears in gladness.
So there's a religious element to it, especially with Kerouac giving out wine, and there's a jazz element to it, in which the poet transforms himself into the jazz musician, which Kerouac understood quite clearly. Go, man. Go, man. It's like that when Ginsberg is reading his poem. Anyway, it electrifies the audience. They suddenly realize they've heard something quite new, absolutely dirty, filthy in certain ways, respects, shocking in certain ways, but hooray for shocking. He shifts from being this kind of nerdy guy with a shock of black hair and stuff and horn-rimmed glasses into a bard, into the poet with a capital P. It's an amazing transformation. And that's what the poem is about, but the audience could see it and feel it as he begins to read it. It's an amazing thing. And that's what they responded to. They responded to that sense of transformation, and if he could do it, they could too. It's a demonic poem.
People are still kind of like, whoa, that was wild, with Kerouac on the stage, pumping his fist.
Gary Snyder also was one of the readers.
Supposedly, when Snyder read, after Howl kind of floored the room, he was able to engage other people there still.
It was McClure's first reading. It might have been Snyder's first reading as well. They all became famous poets, but they were not at the time.
It seems to be very prescient of Gary Snyder to say that it would be a poetical bombshell. But I think it was because he just sensed that here were all these young poets basically from the East Coast, like from Kerouac and Ginsberg, being around New York, and then the Pacific Northwest Coast guys, Whalen and Snyder, and that this was this conjunction and that was coming together. And he'd been around, he'd met Ginsberg and Kerouac and heard about them, and they seemed like legendary people already.
It took place in this rearranged garage. It had been an automotive garage. It had been other things before that, a carriage shop. It had very high ceilings. There were no lights. There were no problems with lights. That is, it wasn't dark. You saw the audience. The audience was right there.
But in those days, most of the poets who read were just, they held the book and they kind of buried their face in the book, and they didn't really look up at the audience very much. It was more like a reading than a performance. The audience was a participant. It didn't have the traditional divide between the people on the stage and the people in the audience who were the observers.
It was a fairly small space. It was packed. It was a remarkable event because Lawrence Ferlinghetti was there.
Lots of Ginsberg's friends were there, including Neil Cassidy and Natalie Jackson, and a lot of people who'd been poets and part of the hipster scene in the city. So
Ann Charters, who's written about the Beats brilliantly, very bright person. She saw the first complete reading of Howl in Berkeley. She liked the reading, but she was shocked by the audience, which seemed to be free-floating, bohemian, sexy, drinking, smoking pot, name it. It was a bohemian scene that shocked her. Well, that was the condition of the Sixth Gallery too, that it was a shocking but liberating event when Ginsberg read that poem with all those dirty words which his father told him to eliminate. It is, in a certain sense, that poem is anti-literature.
It was Ginsberg's first reading. It's his first public reading. He had never publicly read before the Sixth Gallery reading. This is the first time he ever read. And that's another remarkable thing about it. When you think of, and he comes out and he reads that. He doesn't read like earlier pieces of poetry. He reads Howl, but with no ambition about it. Just like, okay, this is going to be. I'm going to break down the doors of this. It's just like it's something I'm working on.
It was a remarkable event because suddenly Ginsberg became famous.
There wasn't really a beat generation in October 1955. I mean, there were people who called themselves hipsters, who listened to jazz and smoked marijuana, and they were on the fringes of society. But I think that there was a bohemian world in San Francisco, or a continuation of bohemian culture that had thrived in San Francisco beginning in the 20s and the 30s. It's a celebration. It's a coming together of a community. It's not just one single artist or two artists.
Between poets, Reinhold Cacoethes in his bow tie and shabby old coat would get up and make a little funny speech in his snide, funny voice and introduce the next reader. But as I say, come 11:30, when all the poems were read and everybody was milling around wondering what had happened and what would come next in American poetry, he was wiping his eyes with his handkerchief.
And at the end of the poem, Kerouac turned to Rexroth and said, this poem is going to make Allen Ginsberg famous from the Bay Bridge, which connects Berkeley to Richmond, from the Bay Bridge to the Golden Gate Bridge. And Rexroth said it's going to make him famous from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Brooklyn Bridge. He realized that it was going to make. It was a national poem. It was just there in the sort of the right time, the right moment, really, to express how the generation was feeling, and then in different parts of the world, also in Eastern Europe, this sort of weariness with bureaucracy and the Cold War and the sort of fear of the bomb, and not willing to sort of live in fear and to cower, but to cry out. I think that's why I called it like a sort of animal scream.
And we all got together with him, the poets, and drove in several cars to Chinatown for a big, fabulous dinner off the Chinese menu with chopsticks, yelling conversation in the middle of the night in one of those free-swinging great Chinese restaurants of San Francisco.
And then there was the critical reception to the poem in a lot of the little magazines of the day, of people like Norman Podhoretz attacking it and blaming Kerouac and Ginsberg for juvenile delinquency, and really made Allen Ginsberg feel really sad to be so misunderstood. And also the fact that the New York Times ran an article about Howl before it was even published as a book. Richard Everhart came out to San Francisco because he'd heard that young poets were performing their work, and that was something new. I don't know if it's ever happened again for the New York Times to write about a poem before it's published as a book.
I remember when I first heard about it. I mean, certainly by the time the Dharma poems came out, Kerouac describes it in there. That might have been the first time I really knew about it. I mean, there weren't history books about this stuff then. It was all kind of word of mouth. And, I hadn't met people like Alan at that point. Maybe I heard a rumor or something, but it wasn't a big media event. It was just a small event in a local neighborhood.
Who sank all night in submarine light of Bickford's floated out and sat through the stale beer afternoon in desolate fugazis, listening to the crack of doom on the hydrogen jukebox.
The poem comes from someplace very deep inside Allen Ginsberg. It's very American kind of expression. The idioms are very American places and people and language, and it's a work of art.
We tend to think of it as, and he did too, as the visions of the unspeakable visions of the individual, as Kerouac said. But it's a poem full of different kinds of voices, different kinds of experiences, different stories. It's a poem that moves us towards multiplicity. Now, he's influenced here by Pound and even by Eliot in certain ways.
He's got these also influence of surrealism, the French surrealists, like an image of like the drunken taxicabs of absolute reality. So there's a lot of things that are very much like Walt Whitman in the poem. T.S. Eliot, I mean, I think Hydrogen Jukebox is a kind of image that Eliot would have appreciated, and The Wasteland is also a poem about the disintegration of the civilization that he knew. And Howl is, it's kind of about this sort of falling apart of America, the old America, and this sort of birth of this new generation who have these people who have visions, and they're on a quest and they're searching for America.
I quoted you something from someone named Clotaire Rapaille in a book called The Culture Code. This is what Rapaille says. The American culture exhibits many of the traits consistent with adolescence. Intense focus on the now, dramatic mood swings, a constant need for exploration and challenge to authority, a fascination with extremes, openness to change and reinvention, and a strong belief that our mistakes warrant second chances. As Americans, we feel we know more than our elders do. All of that is a wonderful description of Howl. I'm not calling Ginsberg an adolescent, but I am saying that adolescence expresses some of the things that he felt the need to express in his poem. And he felt he got it. You know, he said he actually at one point says it's practically an imitation of Jack Kerouac.
Marlon Brando in The Wild One, and James Dean, and rock and roll. I know that both Kerouac and Ginsberg were aware of the development of rock and roll, that young people were changing really before their eyes, and for a time Kerouac was thinking of calling On the Road Rock and Roll Road, which is really a tribute to the influence of rock and roll, just sensing that there's this new generation, and that in a lot of ways they feel linked to this new generation, younger generation, more than to their own peers who they knew from the 40s.
These people were interested, Ginsberg was interested in jazz. Charlie Parker. Other great soloists had the quality almost of a poet presenting his work. And Jack Kerouac took Charlie Parker as his symbol, a kind of emblem for the writer, for the poet, in Mexico City Blues, which had not yet been published, but which Ginsberg had read. And Ginsberg, too, sees Howl as a kind of jazz solo. So what's happening here is that poetry is getting this strong infusion of the oral. It changes the nature of what it means to encounter a poem. Suddenly, the amount of energy that's happening with an oral reading is quite different from the kind of energy that you have from just reading with your eyes.
The fascinating thing about that original reading was its rawness and its anger and its pent-up emotion. I mean, if you think about, for instance, poetry of before that time, poetry was reading Emily Dickinson or Robert Frost or Carl Sandburg on a couch in a nice quiet room with the fire on. And what Ginsberg did was he turned poetry into a performance. It was about all that raw emotion and that expression. And that's what's so fascinating, is the way that idea of emotion, being shouted out.
Apart, dismantled, and dragged to interrogations. No!
And being expressed in that fashion, and it becoming both an art form and a form of entertainment, then does actually continue to reverberate throughout the 1960s and 70s and right up to the present day.
Now later, Howl becomes an exemplar of great literature. It becomes something that in fact is being attacked in the poem at the same time that it's being affirmed, because he's also, at the same time that he's talking dirty, and deliberately so, and putting it in your face, at the same time that he's doing that, he's also saying he's a great poet, and his antecedents are Whitman and Rimbaud and whoever, etc. He's a saint in a certain respect, and he wants that aspect too. The saint is kind of the redemption of the dirty boy who's also talking.
Being in San Francisco in 1955 and looking back at New York, and I think there's a lot of Kerouac in the poem, and there's some Burroughs, and they're all characters. It's sort of like they're with him as he's writing the poem and performing the poem.
Who blew and were blown. I mean, all of that. The whole poem is all about taking something which most people would regard with horror and disgust and saying, it's great. It's marvelous. And that's why it's an attack on so many American values. It's why Lionel Trilling hated the poem, even though he was Ginsberg's teacher at one time. And it's an attack on everything that Lionel Trilling held dear, on culture, on everything that a good liberal would like. It's an amazing poem in that respect. Now later it becomes something that's defended by good liberals. That's another question. Yeah. But its initial thrust is its shocking, in-your-face quality, which at the same time is holy.
Well, it is a spiritual poem, like The Wasteland. Of course, Ginsberg turned increasingly to Buddhism and, well, he had a phase of Hinduism, and there's also a lot of references to Christ and Christianity in the poem. It also reminds me that Ferlinghetti said that, the poem this is not an obscene poem. It's a poem that's pointing out the obscenity of our materialistic, warlike culture.
There's this element of the secret that's very, very, very important. That this is the secrets of my heart that I'm giving you. This is what I really feel. I'm a gay man and I'm not going to hide it. I'm this, that, and the other thing, and I'm not going to hide it. And I enjoy it. And I don't care if you think it's obscene. He's turning it around.
They call you Beat Generation.
The word beat, Kerouac gets this from Herbert Huncke. He's looking around, Kerouac is looking around for a word like lost to describe his generation. Hemingway's generation was the lost generation. What's our generation? Okay. So he's looking around for a word, preferably a four-letter word, to describe his generation. And he's been watching these hipsters in Times Square, and they take heroin, they're interested in jazz, they're fascinating to Kerouac. He's been watching all these guys. And one of them, Herbert Huncke, walks up to him. He's just very tired. And he says, man, I'm beat. And Kerouac looks at him. You sure are. He's got his word. Now, Kerouac is French, Canadian. And in French Canadian, B-E-A-T means something. Beat. It has an accent and it's pronounced Beat. It's not pronounced beat, but it's pronounced Beat. But it means blessed. So you've got these poles on the one hand, beaten down totally, weary. I'm so tired. I saw the best minds of my generation, starving, hysterical, naked, totally beaten down. Beat in that sense. At the end of the poem, everything is holy. That's Beat. Beat means blessed in French. Beatitude, it's the same word. Howl moves from being beaten down, beat in that sense, to at the end of it, beatitude, ecstasy, religious ecstasy. Everything is holy, as he says with Blake, citing Blake. And that's the story of the poem, that we move from one to the other, and that both are present.
I think the core idea of the beat philosophy or viewpoint of life is that people who are literally beaten down have something angelic or beatific about them, that it's a celebration of Americans who are marginalized and on the fringes, of Indians, of people who are exiles and outcasts, and the poem does, I think it's aiming to sort of knit together those people, and to see the spirituality, the spiritual beauty in poverty and homelessness, and beauty it's not just like in a museum or in the worlds of affluence. You can see beauty in Negro streets at dawn of people looking for an angry fix, or even in sort of madness. The Mohammedan angels up on the roof.
He said to me once when we were talking during the interview that there were certain things he realized, that way madness lies, that way Naomi lies. If you go too far in that direction, you're going to turn into a crazy person like your mother. Don't go too far that way. But at the same time, don't hide the madness. It's this kind of situation in which the craziness is partly a kind of attack on proper literature. What in the 50s, you grew up with people who used as a positive term, the term crazy, and meant good. But his mother's crazy, and he doesn't like that. You know, it's a complicated, again, it's crazy, man, but yeah, crazy is disturbing. At what point is crazy liberating? At what point is it disturbing? In a culture that seems too quiet, madness seems like a liberation. But madness caused by the culture, in another sense, is one way the culture controls you. His mother was totally controlled. She's in an institution. It's not liberating, it's the opposite of liberating. And he knows that. And both those feelings are in the poem.
And his letters to Kerouac when he was inside the New York State Psychiatric Institute show that he was already thinking of evolving like a poetics or an aesthetics around madness. And that, of course, also linked to his mother's life and his mother's experience.
Ginsberg's poem, because it was a poem. What can a poem do? You know, a poem doesn't have any power, right? Poem, right? Just a poem. It brought into the mainstream both Ginsberg and the themes that he was talking about.
There's some social scientists, social historians who reject the whole notion of a counterculture. That's a counterculture is impossible. That what happens is that you get certain people who try to take things in a different direction, and they either fail completely and are forgotten, or they succeed and they're absorbed into the culture. And this is what I think you see with Howl, is that it's seen at the time as this great shocking act, but what he's really doing is introducing us to the world we live in today.
Who let themselves be fucked in the ass by saintly motorcyclists and screamed with joy.
I think the best publicity you can get is to be banned. You know, it's worked throughout history. Lady Chatterley's Love is not a very good book, really, by D.H. Lawrence's standards. But everybody wanted to read it because it was banned. Henry Miller, everything of his was banned. And pretty much everything of his was banned in the United States until the late 50s into the 60s. So I think the banning of books was always great publicity because people turn up to hear something and think it's, it's dangerous or it's edgy.
My parents subscribed to Life magazine. It came to the house, and there was an issue that had a photographic essay about the trial of Howl in San Francisco. It had one of the lawyers in the courtroom waving the book. It said Howl. That's how I heard about it. I knew about Kerouac. I knew about On the Road. So I wanted to get a copy of Howl. I took the train from the small town where I was living and went into Manhattan. There was a bookstore on Sheridan Square in Manhattan, and I got Howl and paid 75 cents and took it back home. And then on Monday I took it to school and showed all my buddies in school about this poem. And there were lots of people like that, lots of us like that who shared the poem. And, well, the government wanted to censor the poem. They arrested the shig who was at the cash register in City Lights, and they also arrested Ferlinghetti, and they put him on trial for obscenity, and so they wanted to remove the book from shelves and not have anybody read it. So that was a kind of, as being a teenager, you felt like, or I felt, and I know other people did, as a part of like a kind of secret conspiracy of young readers who shared the poem and shared the view of the poem. And the times were dark and dreary, and kind of anticipates some of the rebellion of the 60s, of people coming out of their apartments and going into the streets. Prophetic poem.
It's a shocking poem, but they had to defend it as if it were a Tale of Two Cities. You know, this is a far, far better thing I do than I've ever done. That kind of thing. They had to defend it as if it were something that isn't shocking, but it's meant to shock.
And it's not just a coincidence that the Beats and Allen Ginsberg reached out to William Carlos Williams, who was a modernist, and that William Carlos Williams, wrote the preface or introduction to Howl, and it was sort of like a member of the older generation, somebody who's part of the modernist movement, saying, here's this new young poet, and you've got to listen to him. And he was a mentor of Allen Ginsberg's.
It would be very rare for poetry to have a spotlight thrown on it, contemporary poetry, to have a spotlight thrown on it by the press or the media. It'd be very rare. It would be, you'd have to do something strange to make poetry interesting to the mass media. The only things that can make poetry interesting to the mass media are things like, putting the guy on trial for obscenity, or, Allen Ginsberg taking all his clothes off and doing a reading, which he did a couple of times, or, some scandal involving the poet, or, those are the things people are interested in en masse. Poetry is a relatively minority kind of art. Well, contemporary poetry is, but that's because it's difficult for people to interpret and understand if they don't want to study in depth. And so poetry is generally marginalized, contemporary poetry is generally marginalized, until the next generation or generation beyond that, when it really does begin to have a real social impact on people.
What The Wasteland did for a generation of people after World War I, Howl did for the generation of people who came of age after World War II. People were still reading Howl in the 60s. Ginsberg, he was a witness for the defense in the Chicago conspiracy trial, and read from Howl, and it certainly informed and educated a lot of people who became hippies and rebels in the 60s. Yeah, people went off to Mississippi to protest against segregation with On the Road and Howl in their back pockets.
It's interesting because Ginsberg was himself, and the Beat poets were themselves really rather sort of apolitical in a traditional sense. That they weren't the type of people who would go out and join a march, for instance. Instead, the actual act of reading the poetry was the political act. In a real sense, they were almost kind of like anarchists. So I think it's quite interesting. I hadn't heard that before about the freedom riders, or in Freedom Summer, the activists bringing Howl with them. It certainly is possible, and it doesn't surprise me. But partly, I think it illustrates this kind of tendency that what has happened by the 1960s is these poems, and in particular Howl, become almost a sort of a badge of revolution. It's part of the fashion of revolution. And so to have it with you is evidence that you're a bona fide revolutionary, that you're intent upon changing society. Because the interesting thing about this, Howl and Ginsberg, is that these were, their links are more with the hippie movement rather than with the protest movement. And very often in the 1960s, those two movements clashed with each other because they had very different goals.
I think the most important thing was the kind of social impact, drawing attention to the way America was lying to itself. And when people started paying attention to the Beats, it wasn't till the end of the 50s into the 60s. While there were social critics in the 40s and into the 50s, hardly anybody knew about them anyway. It's interesting to think, did they have any real social impact? Or are they merely an inspiration to a new generation of people who were more directly involved in trying to change society? As Allen Ginsberg said, he didn't want to change. He didn't want to create a social movement. He just wanted to make poems and enjoy life and express themselves.
I think what's interesting about the whole Beat poets and the Six Gallery reading is not so much that it's a revolution, but rather that it's a premonition. It's a premonition of so many different things that we identify with the 1960s. So, for instance, you get this sort of sexual liberation. You get the recognition of homosexuality. There's elements of environmentalism in the poems by Snyder, for instance, and Kerouac.
It's a poem that crosses all kinds of boundaries, international boundaries. Howl's been translated into more than 24 languages, and Russian poets would get together with Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti and had readings in Albert Hall and in the 60s, early 60s in London.
If we're talking about the influence of Ginsberg and Howl and both the style and the emotion of that original reading, we can look not just at what happens in America, but also the way it crosses the Atlantic. And the perfect example of that is Adrian Mitchell's reading of Tell Me Lies About Vietnam in 1965.
Tell me lies about Vietnam. Heard the alarm clock screaming with pain. Couldn't find myself, so I went back to sleep again. So fill my ears with silver, stick my legs in plaster. Tell me lies about Vietnam.
So 10 years later, and it's very much, it's a powerful poem. It's about, the hypocrisy of this war, but it's also about how that hypocrisy is tearing the poet apart.
It sparked a lot, sort of a kind of global brotherhood of poets, and who really sort of defying the sort of Cold Law rigidities.
The thing about Allen Ginsberg is that he is so atypical of what at that time people thought of as a poet. Poets were very introspective type of people. They had these feelings deep inside them, and they wrote about them beautifully and with great economy of expression through their poetry. There's nothing economical about Howl. It's just, it's all over the place. It's long, and he doesn't hold anything back. It's very expressive. So in that sense, he doesn't fit in with the idea of a poet. But I think the other issue about Ginsberg is that he was a brilliant publicist. Even right down to the idea of the way he publicized that original reading at the Sixth Gallery. And he made those postcards and the flyers about it. And it was like he was sort of single-handedly changing the way people saw poetry and the way they experienced poetry. That poetry became a public act. And publicity is all part of it. A lot of the successful people of the 1960s, the successful protesters of the 1960s, are those in the Ginsberg mold who had the big ideas and were willing to revolt against the system, but also knew how to create the big events. Someone, for instance, like Jerry Rubin, who also goes on to become a publicist, PR man, after the 1960s. Tom Hayden, for instance. They're all really good at creating, high-profile events. And that all sort of has its roots in Ginsberg and what he was doing in 55.
And I want people to be able to be allowed to live more naturally and more spontaneously. I think it's the most important part, spontaneous. That doesn't mean you just do the first thing that comes into your head. It means you have to learn how to live in the world, and then you can be spontaneous. It's a long process, and that's why you first have to learn how to be, and then before you can be spontaneous.
It does seem like it's, if I can include you, there's a number of young women who are turning to Howl and appreciating it and kind of remaking it as a poem for women, as a feminist poem.
The first reading of Howl on October 7th, 1955 at the Sixth Poet at Sixth Gallery reading was a cataclysmic and historic event. It burst open the door of the American soul and publicly discussed for the first time major issues that are still hotly debated: homosexuality, mental illness, the military-industrial complex, and environmentalism. It foreshadowed the revolutions of the 60s and 70s. It also transformed poetry readings into a form of popular entertainment. It was one of the first public performance poetry events, and also the first to use posters and postcards to publicize it. This form of the poetry event, as an entertaining, performance-based reading, influenced poetry scenes all over the world. The style of Howl, as well, had a major influence on international and national poets. Its emphasis on using the poetic form to express human truths and nakedness, as well as to discuss intimate thoughts and political issues reverberated in the conforming, paranoid Cold War period. Howl, a counterculture poem written and performed by Allen Ginsberg, has become a part of the American literary canon. It has become a ritual reenacted in cities all over the world that celebrate, remember, and relive that moment of transformative truth in 1955. And it should continue to be celebrated and remembered and relived. It will. But also, it should continue to question our society, to be dangerous, to shock.
With the absolute heart of the poem of life, butchered out of their own bodies, good to eat 1,000 years.
Well, it was hard not to meet Allen Ginsberg in New York in the 60s. I mean, he was there at parties, he was there at demonstrations. When I was at Columbia, I had some friends who were students and who were also poets, and they would go and visit Allen Ginsberg, and then they would they would come back and talk about what it was, what he had said or what he had done, and in some ways he just seemed, he seemed a little nutty, actually, really. I mean, because he wasn't always trying to make a lot of sense.